hear me, Ian?
Now I can, yes.
Perfect, perfect. So let me switch to English then. I worked with them for a couple of decades, basically stationed in Washington and working. We can probably present yourself better, Ian, but basically bringing the world of politics to, amongst other parties, the world of finance and investors and lobbyists, etc. So I think it's really good and really interesting to have someone from the ground working with politics in Washington to speak to us rather than myself or someone pseudo expert on US politics. And Ian, you have prepared some 15 slides, so I thought we can go through the slides. I would try to do my best to flick amongst them. Yeah, and then do a quick Q&A. And after that, me and my colleague Henning, who's also working in asset management, will make a short statement what's going to happen in the equity market based on this, basically, and what's going to happen and so forth. So Ian, please, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, great. Thanks, Jonas. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with the group today. I'm very much looking forward to it. As Jonas said, my name is Ian Graig. I'm the Chief Executive of Global Policy Group. We're a consulting firm here in Washington, D.C., and we work with companies based in the U.S., Europe, and Japan to help them stay on top of what's going on here in Washington and how it can affect the markets and how it can affect their business interests here in the U.S. and abroad. And what I'm going to do today, as Jonas said, is speak for about half an hour about the U.S. midterm elections, and then talk about some of the implications of potential outcomes, and then look forward to answering any of your questions. And if we could move to the first slide, please, that'd be great. So what we have coming up on November 8th are elections here in the United States that may not be getting as much attention in Europe as our elections receive when it's a presidential election. This is just an election for members of Congress and then also for governors of our states and for state legislatures. What I want to emphasize, though, is that this is a very, very important election. It obviously does not get the attention of a presidential election, but it is very, very important. It will have a very big impact on policy here in the United States, not just for the next 2 years, which it clearly will affect, but then also beyond, because this will also set the stage for our presidential and congressional elections in 2024. So what's at stake on November 8th when the voters go to the polls? First of all, control of the Congress is very much at stake. As you know, we have a bicameral Congress with 2 chambers. The Senate is the upper house, and our House of Representatives is the lower house. Control of both of those houses of Congress is at stake in 3 weeks. We have elections for 35 of the 100 seats in the Senate. Right now, we have a 50-50 tie between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, but the Democrats have effective control because Senate rules allow Vice President Harris to break any tie votes. So therefore, the Democrats have a majority effectively, but the reality is our Senate is split 50-50. We also have elections for every member of the U.S. House of Representatives, all 435 of them. Right now, the Democrats have a narrow 220, apologies for the typo there, that's 220 to 212 majority, the 3 vacancies. So that is a very narrow majority in the House of Representatives, and that is at stake in the elections. I will not be talking about the state elections at all. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, but they're extremely important for a lot of issues. For example, for environmental policy and climate policy, much of that is done at the state level here in the United States. We have elections for 36 of our 50 governors, and we also have elections for 46 of the state legislatures out of the 50. So those elections are actually very important as well. Finally, in light of what happened in our last election cycle, in terms of the assault on the Capitol on January 6th, in terms of the continued questioning of the outcome of the 2020 elections, the midterm elections really are a test of the health of our electoral system. People are nervous about what could happen, nervous about whether election results will be questioned. And so the smooth functioning of this election is very important in terms of us moving forward, and it will be a real test of the health of the U.S. Electoral system. And then, as I said, it's important to remember that this outcome will have a significant impact on U.S. policy in 2023 and 2024. Those are the years when the new Congress will serve. And Joe Biden's policy options very heavily depend on the outcome of the midterm election results. And if we could move to the next slide, please. Set the stage a little bit. As you well know, we have a very difficult political environment here in Washington, D.C. and in the United States. It's very polarized, very high level of partisanship. There's a long-lasting impact of the election dispute last time, in part because Donald Trump keeps talking about it, but also there's a long-lasting impact of the January 6th assault on the Capitol building. So it's created a very polarized atmosphere here in Washington and indeed across the country. Look at the two parties. The Democrats, though they have majorities in the House and the Senate and control the White House, they nonetheless face some severe internal tensions which have limited some of Joe Biden's options as president. We have a very progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is very influential, and then the moderate wing, which is the wing that Joe Biden resides in, which is also influential, and they clash against one another on many policy issues. Joe Biden, as you well know, does not rate very highly in popularity at the moment, and therefore many Democratic candidates have actually kept a distance from President Biden during this election process. On the other side, former President Trump really dominates the Republican Party right now. His endorsements were very influential during the Republican primaries. Many Republicans have adopted his policy views, for example, his isolationism, his nationalism. They've also adopted his style, the kind of abrasive and hard-hitting style that he has. And also a majority of Republican candidates have embraced his claims that there was fraud in the 2020 election, despite the fact that there's absolutely no evidence that there was any fraud. And looking to the voters, we have this polarized political situation. We also obviously have, as is felt in Europe as well, high concerns about the economy and about inflation, the impact of rising prices, food prices, fuel prices, and also, of course, the impact of rising interest rates. The Fed is obviously moving aggressively to raise our interest rates, but our mortgage rates, for example, have risen even faster, and this is having a really clear impact on people's attitudes about the economy and also perhaps on their decisions in this year's elections. Next slide, please. Having laid out the situation here where we do have this very partisan and polarized atmosphere, it's important to notice and point out that actually over the last 2 years, we've accomplished the Congress and President Biden have accomplished quite a bit here in Washington. The midterms come 2 years after 2 years in which Biden has passed significant legislation with the help of the Democratic majority in Congress, but often also with the help of Republicans, especially in the Senate, because a lot of these bills passed on a bipartisan basis. For example, we had a $1.9 trillion in pandemic relief that passed in March of 2021. On the one hand, this obviously helps stabilize our economy. On the other hand, it's obviously being criticized now for having perhaps helped fueled inflation. But that bill did pass with bipartisan support and did help stabilize our economy during the pandemic. We had a $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed. That will be implemented over the next 5 years and fund a lot of infrastructure projects here in the United States, especially in terms of renewable energy and electric vehicle infrastructure. We raised the debt ceiling until the summer of 2023. There's been bipartisan support for sanctions on Russia and for aid to the Ukraine, bipartisan support for something called the CHIPS Act, which provides a great deal of support for the semiconductor industry. And that also was driven by a focus on competition with China, which is a position that has very strong bipartisan support in Congress as well. Finally, one important thing that did pass just with Democratic votes, and that was just recently, it's called the Inflation Reduction Act. That is a major piece of climate, health, energy, and tax legislation that passed in August. It contained, for example, $385 billion in climate and energy program funding for the next 10 years. Republicans were unified in opposition to this bill, but this bill was in some ways the exception to the bipartisanship that we've seen here in Washington in the last few years. And if we go to the next slide, please. And at this point, having sort of set the stage a little bit, I would like to now turn to the elections itself and the outlook for the elections moving forward, and then also to look at some of the implications. On the Republican side, Republicans have been very optimistic about these elections throughout the entire year. First of all, as I pointed out earlier, we have very narrow Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate. So that obviously gives Republicans a chance to win control in either chamber. Secondly, we have a historical fact that the president's party has lost seats in the House 17 times and seats in the Senate 13 times in the last 19 midterm elections. President's party just tends not to do well in midterm elections. In 2010, for example, which was the election soon after Barack Obama was elected president, the Democrats lost 63 seats in the House. In 1994, the first election after Bill Clinton became president, the Democrats lost 54 seats in the House. So midterms are not good for our president's party, and that gives Republicans hope and optimism in this election. That's also driven by President Biden's poor approval readings. As you see here, 52% of Americans disapprove of the job that he is doing. And then finally, obviously, about concerns about the economy and inflation driving worries on the behalf of voters as they go to the polls. Recently, you've seen a little bit of a revival of hopes on the Democratic side, however. The key driver in this, in many ways, was the ruling by our highest court, the U.S. Supreme Court, which essentially overturned abortion access ruling called Roe v. Wade that had given Americans access to abortion. The Supreme Court overturned that ruling, and this has really energized Democratic voters, and Democrats are hopeful that it will also energize women and the young to turn out and to vote for Democratic candidates. In addition, I mentioned earlier that the Democrats have passed major climate, health, and infrastructure bills. This has kind of energized a lot of younger voters who are especially interested in climate issues. We've also seen a bit of a rebound in President Biden's approval rating. It had been as low as 37%. It's now up to 43%. That's not great, but it's better than 37%, obviously. So the Democrats have grown a little more hopeful. They're concerned now that perhaps the impact of the abortion ruling, for example, is fading, and that may not carry through to Election Day. But nonetheless, the outlook is better for Democrats now than it was early in this year when it looked like Republicans were going to have a massive sweep in this election. And finally, there's one wild card out there, and that's Donald Trump. We don't know what impact Donald Trump will have on the election. He energizes Republican voters, but he also energizes Democratic voters. And the more he's in the news, it can actually be good. It's just hard to figure out. It can energize voters on both sides, and it's hard to figure out the impact going into this election. If we go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, we have two houses in our Congress, and I want to look at each quickly to highlight the situation in the election. On the Senate side, as I mentioned, we have an extremely tight race for control of the Senate, split 50-50. Right now, there are 35 Senate elections this year. The Republicans are going to be defending 21 seats. The Democrats are going to be defending 14 seats. That sounds like it should favor the Democrats, but the reality is a lot of those Democratic seats are not safe, and a large number of Republican seats are safe. So the advantage is not as great as it might appear. Republicans do, however, have some concerns about what Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell called candidate quality. And that's because a lot of candidates who are fairly extreme in their views were nominated for the Senate because they were endorsed by former President Trump. And the Republicans are concerned that they may lose some of these elections simply because those candidates are very extreme for a general election. They were popular in the primary, but they may not be popular in the general election. Republicans need to pick up a net gain of only one seat to win a majority, so it's really up in the air at this time. That 5 key toss-up races in Georgia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Wisconsin are really the ones that will decide this election. Those are the ones that will determine who has a majority. As I said, there's no clear favorite in the race for the Senate majority, but an important thing to point out is that in the Senate, you really need 60 votes to have what's called a filibuster-proof majority. A filibuster is a parliamentary tactic by which the minority party can basically prevent the majority from voting on legislation. You have to have 60 votes to stop a filibuster, and neither party will have 60 votes going into the new Senate. So there will be a need in the Senate, regardless of who's in the majority, for the majority party to work with the minority to pass legislation. If we go to the next slide, please. On the House side, as I mentioned, all 435 House seats are going to be contested. The Republicans need a net gain of just 5 seats to win a majority in the new House of Representatives, which starts in January. There are many Republican advantages. I mentioned the history in terms of House elections. The Democrats also have 29 seats that are considered toss-ups or even worse. Republicans have only 12 seats that fall in that category. Only 11 of the Republican-held seats are in districts that were won by Joe Biden in the 2020 election. Every 10 years, we adjust the lines on the maps of our congressional districts. That just happened. Changes are based on our census, which is taken every 10 years. And that redistricting process was a slight advantage for the Republican Party. So that's helpful for them in the House elections. And then finally, more Democrats retired than Republicans. There were 32 Democrats who retired before this election and only 20 Republicans. So that's once again an advantage for the Republicans. At this time, the Republicans are slightly favored to win the 218 seats. They need to have a majority in the new Congress. But as I said, that's not a certain outcome by any means. But you would have to say the Republicans have a very, very good chance at taking control of the House. Next slide, please. Now, what are the issues that are dominating our election as we move towards November 8th? The Republican side, they're focusing on inflation and the economy. Voters are very concerned about both these issues, and Republicans are blaming inflation, blaming our current economic issues on President Biden, on our high deficits, and on the economic stimulus package that passed earlier. Republicans don't really offer any solutions themselves. They are just criticizing the Democrats for the current economic situation. The president is always blamed when the economy is not good. Republicans are also highlighting concerns about crime, which is traditionally a Republican issue, about immigration, which is a very strong issue among supporters of former President Trump, and then also some social issues in terms of, for example, same-sex marriage, which are of concern to conservative evangelical voters, evangelical Christians, who are strong supporters of the Republican Party. On the Democratic side, they're focusing on the abortion access issue, which I mentioned earlier. They're also focused on health care, which is always a strong issue for Democrats. And they're focused on former President Trump and on the January 6th assault on the Capitol. We've had congressional hearings, which featured some very striking video testimony from folks who were there that day. And Democrats are really highlighting this and arguing that Republicans cannot be given control of the Congress in light of what happened on January 6th. Democrats have also been pointing to the action they've taken thus far in Congress on climate change, and then also at the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed in Congress. You can see here, though, that if you look at the top issues for voters overall, inflation is really the biggest issue. Abortion is the second biggest issue. That's largely the main Democratic concern. One thing that's not really an issue at all is foreign policy, which is usually the case in the U.S. Election campaigns, and that's even true in terms of Ukraine. Ukraine, sanctions on Russia, et cetera, have not been an issue in this election campaign. So if we go to the next slide, please. And let's look at perhaps what are the most likely outcomes in the election. There are really two outcomes that are most likely, a third that's possible, and a fourth that seems very unlikely. The two that are most likely, first of all, is probably that the Republicans win the House, Democrats keep the Senate. If this happens, there's a risk of legislative gridlock. There's some real risk of some crises when we have to raise our public debt, when we have to pass government funding bills. That's probably the most likely outcome. A little bit behind that would be Republicans capturing both the House and the Senate. If that happens, not a lot's going to get done in Washington because Joe Biden will veto a lot of the things that Republicans try to pass, and they will not be able to override his veto. A third outcome, which is potential, but perhaps a bit less likely, is that the Democrats keep both chambers. In this instance, the Democrats will try to pass a lot of the progressive issues that they could not get through Congress thus far, but they'll still have difficulty passing those because they won't have a large enough majority in the Senate to do so. And then probably the least likely outcome is that the Democrats win the House and the Republicans keep the Senate. This is a potential outcome, but you could see some things get done if this is what happens. And if we could go to the next slide, let's walk through in a little more detail some of the implications of potential election outcomes. First, looking at what happens if the Republicans win the House. Excuse me. If the Republicans win the majority in the House of Representatives, we'll likely see legislative gridlock here in Washington. What you'll see is a lot of investigations of President Biden's family, in particular of the business dealings of his son, Hunter. You'll see investigations of his administration. You'll see an end to the inquiry into the January 6th assault on the Capitol, and you may very well see an impeachment of President Biden. This doesn't mean that President Biden is going to be removed from office. We have a two-step process, and the House impeaches, but the Senate must convict. He will not be removed from office, but it is possible that the House would impeach him. You could see a real weakening in support for our aid to Ukraine and also in support for NATO. You could see President Biden increasingly rely on executive actions to keep making progress on climate change, because no climate or environmental legislation will pass if Republicans win the House. You'll see a much higher risk of a crisis in terms of defaulting on our public debt when the debt ceiling needs to be raised in the summer of 2023. Republicans have already started to say that they're going to use that to try to pass legislation. That could lead to a default crisis, which obviously could shake financial markets. And then finally, you'll see a higher risk of government shutdowns at the start of each fiscal year on October 1st. This is because Republicans and Democrats will have difficulty agreeing on our spending legislation. In this scenario, Republicans will not be able to roll back too many of Biden's policies, but the Democrats also will not be able to expand those policies. Now, if we go to the next slide and look at what would happen if Republicans win not just the House, but also the Senate. In that case, once again, you'll see all the investigations that I spoke about earlier. Those will now take place in both chambers. You'll see greater oversight of policies by Congress. You'll see more efforts to roll back Biden administration policies. These would focus on rolling back support for renewable energy, rolling back electric vehicle incentives, rolling back climate policies, rolling back an expansion in the Internal Revenue Service funding, which was recently enacted, rolling back some of President Biden's Medicare reforms. For example, our Medicare system, which is our healthcare system for older Americans, can now negotiate prescription drug prices. There will be an effort to roll back that provision as an example. President Biden will be able to veto most of these changes, but Republicans might be able to force some through, and also Republicans will be very much be able to block funding for a lot of Biden administration initiatives, for example, in terms of renewable energy or climate change. Republicans will use what are called must-pass bills to push through their priorities. So this is, for example, the bill that will have to be considered to raise our public debt. Once again, this would raise risks of crises around the potential default and potential government shutdowns. Republicans could pass a ban on abortions or legislation on social issues. Those would likely be vetoed and would not be enacted. They would be more political gestures by the Republicans. Republicans would block President Biden's judicial nominees. This is actually very important because our court system plays a very important role in determining which policies survive here in the United States. And there have been a lot of court challenges recently, for example, to regulatory policies and to climate policy. Finally, though, it's important to point out that the House and Senate Republicans are very different, and they themselves could clash with one another, which would create, once again, the possibility of even further gridlock here in Washington. And then finally, to a third scenario, if we could change the slide, please. And we'll look at what happens if the Democrats win both chambers. In this case, Democrats will move to pass those policies that they could not pass in the first 2 years of the Biden presidency. For example, they'll move to protect abortion access. They'll move to protect same-sex marriage. They'll move to expand voting rights. They'll move to expand healthcare and child care programs. They will continue to have difficulty passing these things because of their Senate majority will not be large enough, but they will continue to try. There will be full funding for all climate and energy programs, though. There'll be support in Congress for efforts by the state of California and other states to address climate change. California is a leading state in taking steps to address climate change, and their policies have national implications. There'll be continued support for Ukraine, continued support for NATO. You might also see continuation of the investigation into the January 6th assault on the Capitol. Democrats will move to confirm as many judges as they can, and there probably would be less risk of a default or a government shutdown crisis. A key question about in terms of what Democrats could get done is how big a majority they have in the Senate. If it remains a 50-50 Senate, they may not be able to get that much done. If they get up to about 52, 53 seats, then that's different. They could actually probably accomplish quite a bit. And if we go to the next slide, please. So those are some of the scenarios for what could happen and what could change with this election. And as you could see, there's actually quite a bit that could change as a result of this election. Some things aren't going to change that much, though. First of all, we're going to continue to see growing deficits here in the United States. We have increased spending in line. If we have a recession, that will push up spending even further while pushing down revenues. We have rising interest rates, which are important in light of the size of our public debt. And the reality is neither party is really focused on deficits. You're see more spending probably if the Democrats win both the House and the Senate. You'll see more of an effort to control spending if Republicans do. But the reality is neither party has placed deficit reduction as a top priority. And in fact, you saw deficits go up significantly during the time that Donald Trump was president and the Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate. Our infrastructure spending will continue regardless of what happens in the election. We have $1.2 trillion in the pipeline to be spent over the next 10 years on infrastructure, largely on transportation infrastructure, and that will continue to go forward. That's an important driver of jobs, obviously, also a driver of efficiency, because we are very much in need of infrastructure improvements here in the United States. There won't be much impact on trade policy. Republicans are not as supportive of free trade as they once were. The Donald Trump wing of the Republican Party is not a pro-free trade party wing of the party. President Biden's trade policies have reasonably broad bipartisan support. And you would continue to see very strong support in Congress on a bipartisan basis for policies, tough policies towards China. We just saw last week, for example, the Biden administration announced new export control policies targeting Chinese semiconductor and supercomputers. These policies will continue to be implemented. Strong support for tough policy towards China, strong support for policies that support Taiwan. That'll continue regardless of the election outcome. And if we go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight some dates to keep in mind as you look at our election process going forward and then going into the next few years. Just our fiscal year actually, our current fiscal year actually started on October 1st, but Congress has not passed funding legislation for the full year, and so that's an issue that will have to come up again. Election day is November 8th. As I said, we have elections in all 50 states. We will see elections for all control of both our national legislatures, but then also control for state houses and for governorships decided on election day. There is a real potential for the election results to be delayed or challenged in light of the strong support among Republican candidates for questioning the outcome of the last election. And so we may not know who has won the election for quite a bit of time after Election Day. One thing that could also happen is on December 8th, there could be a runoff election for the Georgia Senate seat. And once again, that seat could decide who has a majority in the Senate. Rules in Georgia are such that if no candidate gets over 50% of the vote on Election Day, you have a runoff election between the top two candidates. And there actually are 3 candidates in the Georgia Senate election. So it's possible that neither of them neither the leading candidates will get 50% of the vote. And therefore, you could see a runoff on December 8th, which could decide control of the Senate. Ironically, there were 2 runoff elections in 2021. In January 2021 in Georgia that decided control of the current Senate. So we could see that happen once again. Congress returns after the election. The current Congress, this is called a lame duck session. They return after the current after the election, and the most important thing on their agenda will be on December 16th. They face a deadline to pass a federal funding bill, or we'll see a government shutdown. They'll likely be able to do this. And the lame duck session will last for a few weeks in December. The target for adjournment of the current Congress, which is the 117th Congress, is December 22nd. On January 3rd, we'll see the start of the new Congress. So these are the people who will be elected on Election Day. They will start serving on January 3rd. That will be the 118th Congress. We're likely to see new leaders in the House of Representatives, regardless of the outcome of the election. But we will not see new leadership in the Senate. That's going to stay the same. Sometime in late summer or early autumn, we have to raise our debt ceiling or face the risk of a default on our public debt. That's not an exact date, but it will happen sometime in the late summer or the early autumn. And then finally, in January 2024, we'll see the first nominating primaries and caucuses for the 2024 presidential election. The reality, of course, though, is that the election campaign will start well before January 2024. And if we could go to the next slide, it's obviously right now, no one knows what the situation is going to be. It's just completely unclear. Will Joe Biden run again? He hasn't said. Some Democrats, actually many Democrats did not want him to earlier in the year, but he's gotten quite a bit done. And now some Democrats are thinking maybe they do want him to run. On the other hand, he's 80 years old. And so he is going to be obviously the oldest president by quite a bit were he to get reelected. And so there will be pressure on him not to run as well. If Biden decides not to run, who will the Democrats pick? No one knows right now. It seems unlikely to be Vice President Harris, but it could be. There's positioning by, for example, former presidential candidate, currently Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who we have pictured there. California Governor Gavin Newsom has made it pretty clear that he's thinking about running if Joe Biden doesn't run. The list is long, and it would be a wide open primary process. Will President Trump, former President Trump, run again? He hints he will, but he hasn't said whether he will or not. If he decides not to, there are lots of Republicans that would jump in, but maybe will some Republicans challenge him even if he says he's going to run again? It seems unlikely, but it's possible. But Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has been making it clear that he would consider running for president. So a lot of this will start to be clarified next year after the midterm elections. And in point of fact, the midterm elections will have an impact on our 2024 presidential process as well, especially on the Republican side, where if Donald Trump's choices, the people he endorsed in the primaries, if his choices lose, that will hurt his standing with Republicans. If his choices win, that will obviously boost his strength in the Republican Party. On the Democratic side, if Democrats manage to stay in control of both houses of Congress, there might be a better chance that President Biden would decide to run for re-election. If they suffer severe losses, then Biden might partly be blamed and might make him more likely to step aside. We just don't know. But it will become a little more clear after the outcome of our elections, which take place on November 8th. And with that, I'm happy to stop talking and answer any questions you might have on anything that I touched base on, but also obviously on anything else here in Washington that is of interest to you that I might not have talked about. But thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Ian. That was really interesting. We have a microphone that we're going to pass around for Q&A. Anyone waiting for a question? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, sir. My name is Robert. I'm an MD, and I would like to know your opinion about how the Americans feel about the future aid to Ukraine, and what do you think will happen?
Well, thanks for thank you for that good question. There is and has been strong support for aid to Ukraine. Really, this was not a partisan issue for the last year. Republicans and Democrats alike have supported aid to Ukraine, have supported tough sanctions on Russia. However, that may be starting to soften a little bit for two reasons. First of all, we recently, just this week, last week, in fact, the top Republican in the House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy from California, indicated that aid to Ukraine that Ukraine could not expect a blank check for aid. And he said that if Republicans take control of the House, they will definitely look at starting to reduce some of our military aid and to Ukraine. In addition, the wing of the Republican Party that's closely aligned with President Trump has questioned our relationship with NATO, and it includes some folks who have, in the past, before the invasion of Ukraine, had spoken favorably of Russian President Putin. So that wing of the party, if they gain influence in the election, perhaps might once again put some restraint on our aid for Ukraine. So to date, there's strong support for aid to Ukraine. If Republicans capture control of one of the houses of Congress, there'll be some pushback on that aid. You'll continue to see support for Ukraine, but that will weaken a bit if the Republicans win control of one of the houses of Congress.
Thanks. Any other questions?
I have a question regarding inflation. What's the difference, how the different parties going to tackle that in the US?
That's a good question, and I would like to ask the two parties that as well, because neither has offered much of a suggestion of how they would do so. The Republicans say, with some justification, obviously, that one of the drivers of inflation was the large economic stimulus package that was passed during the latter part of the pandemic. They argue that there was too much stimulus involved in that. They do not, however, talk about necessarily rolling back the provisions in that package. What you would probably see the Republicans try to do is reduce government spending somewhat. That's obviously not going to have an immediate short-term impact on inflation. They would also try to boost production of fossil fuels to try to expand domestic oil production, expand production and export of LNG and natural gas in an effort to perhaps restrain energy prices. But beyond that, Republicans have not really offered any suggestions for what they're going to do to address inflation. On the Democratic side, you've obviously seen the Biden administration move to try to boost oil production and to boost global oil supply, despite their pledges to reduce the use of fossil fuels. You saw Biden try to get the Saudis to boost production. That obviously failed miserably. You may see the United States try to start to allow Chevron to produce oil in Venezuela in an effort to control oil prices a little bit. But the Biden administration really hasn't done that much and isn't that much that they can do perhaps on inflation. I think basically the view in Washington is that at the moment it's in the court of the Federal Reserve, and that hopefully the Fed's interest rate increases will slow inflation without us falling into a recession, or at least not falling into a tough recession. So Republicans offer a lot of criticism on inflation, but don't offer a lot of policy options, and the Democrats are trying to avoid talking about the issue because it just reminds voters how much prices have been going up.
Any other question? With that, Ian, I think we're going to thank you, and not to be rude, but we will disconnect you and switch over to Swedish.
Okay, my Swedish skills are so that's all right.
That's right. Well, I'll speak to you later on.
Oh, thanks very much. It was great. I hope you found that interesting, and it was really a lot of fun, and I hope you guys have a good discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks. All right, då tänkte jag ge ordet till Henning då, och gå över på svenska. För att kolla lite grann på vad som har hänt med börsen givet tidigare val, mellanårsval.
Så att om vi kommer ihåg bilden som vi fick av Ian här då på sannolikheter över valutfallet då har vi tittat på hur det historiskt sett har tett sig sedan 1928 på amerikansk börs, och då har vi tittat enbart på S&P 500. Och då får vi egentligen det här, och det bökiga är väl då att vi har inte jättemycket data då på det mest sannolika caset, det vill säga att republikanerna tar huset och demokraterna tar senaten med en demokratisk president. Men då har vi i alla fall avkastat då, om man håller amerikansk börs i 1 år, 365 dagar, Då får man 7,59% historiskt i snitt. Och sen så då i nedfallande grad i sannolikhet då, om vi kommer ihåg då att vi hade 32% sannolikhet att republikanerna tar både senaten och huset. Och då får vi då kanske det bästa börsmässiga utfallet då. Så att historiskt sett så skulle ur förvaltarperspektiv det vara väldigt intressant då. Men det här är tyvärr inte jättestatistiskt underbyggt då, med tanke på att vi har så pass få tidsserier att titta på. Men intressant att se då i alla fall att alla de här 3 utfallen är positivt för börs. Och sen så håller vi på att utvärdera då hur signifikant det här mellanårsvalet är då de facto. Men kontentan är då i alla fall att man bör förvänta sig en positiv utveckling på amerikansk börs. Och sen så huruvida det är åknutet till vilken president och vilka det som sköter senaten respektive huset får vi återkomma på. Men historisk data då pekar på att det bör vara positivt för investerare i amerikansk börs. Ja. Så här, det finns väl flera sätt att se på det. Absolut, det har ju varit en stärkelse av dollarn i mångt och mycket i någon flykt till säkerhet. Och sen så då om vi ser på att räntor börjar gå upp då, så kan det gå över till liksom vad som kallas en carry trade. Det vill säga att man vill fånga överavkastningen i amerikanska räntebärare till exempel. Så att frågan är väl när det bytet sker och om det sker. Men vi är vaksamma över och håller med om att det ser väldigt dyrt ut. Så vi har ju då tagit val i portföljerna för att tilta om då från en väldigt tung exponering mot amerikansk dollar i början på året till nu en mindre övervikt kan vi säga då. Vi är fortfarande väldigt, väldigt långa dollar på det sättet. Så att det får vi absolut se hur det slår. Frågan blir väl då om vi ser, som i förlängning på din fråga, om vi ser att det finns några andra alternativ som är bättre. Vi hoppas ju då på för egen del att svenska kronan kanske stärks i och med att vi ser att svensk BNP-data och svensk börs eller nordisk börs i förlängningen går ganska bra. Så att vi får utvärdera och avvakta. Men absolut, det ser dyrt ut.
Andra frågor? Vi gick ju från i början av kriget, eller dagen innan kriget bröt ut, hade vi 98% av portföljerna i dollar. Den globala portföljen då. Och idag är det 47%. Så vi har ju försökt frontrunna slutet på den här dollarrusningen. Men vi är fortfarande 100% korta kronan. Så det är till och med så att vi i den globala aktieportföljen nu har köpt pund. Vilket ju låter hysteriskt med tanke på vad som hänt i Storbritannien. Men inte att förglömma, kronan är sämre än pundet. Så vi till och med tjänar pengar på det. Och sen är det euro, norska kronan som vi också håller. Så det är ju en process tror jag. Sen lite grann, sen är det kittande precis som Henning är inne på. Börsen är ju bra i det här scenariot, eller bra, nu får man ju, alltså nu lämnar politiken och allt sånt här vid sidan utanför dörren här. Nu tittar vi bara förvaltarmässigt på en republikansk vinst. Det som också är intressant att titta på, det är ju vilka strategier sitter på då i böckerna. Ni som har förvaltningen här ser att vi har ju ganska mycket clean energy exempelvis i USA. Och det är ju inte helt jättetuff gissning att misstänka att den sektorn kommer att få sig en knäpp på näsan. Och kanske att så här tung infrastruktur och energi kommer att gå betydligt bättre. Och nu har vi en månad på oss, så vi sitter ju nu och utvärderar. Ska vi skiffla om från clean energy till någon typ av infrastruktur som ändå inte så att säga är helt ohållbar. Det finns ju sådana. Man måste utveckla massa nya rörsystem i USA och vägar och annat som faktiskt ska göra också miljömässigt anpassade. Där sitter vi och funderar också såklart på hur vi ska se på saken. Men annars är det som är spännande också med USA att nu har vi BNP nästa vecka. USA kommer komma upp på 2,5% ungefär tillväxt under det här kvartalet, under Q3. Samtidigt går Europa in i recession. Det är våra prognoser. Så det är ju, även med det här valet så är ju fortfarande USA vår föredragna marknad för största aktieexponeringar. För det är så pass Även om man kan vara orolig för USA så är marknaden livrädd för Europa. Och det är väl en sån här sak att komma ihåg någonstans. Men det är roliga där, som svensk, är ju att Stockholmsbörsen, precis som Henning var inne på med det nordiska, vi handlar ju mer på USA än på Europa. Och det är ju faktiskt väldigt kul i det här fallet, för nu är taktiskt Stockholmsbörsen bättre än globala börser. Och det är ju faktiskt ganska roligt. Och så får man hoppas på att börsen inte bara fokuserar på domestik svensk makro. Som vi gjorde i januari, ni kommer ihåg vad som hände i januari på Stockholmsbörsen. Då var det ju en helt annan resa då.
Ja. Och sen så i förlängningen av andra positioneringar där vi har tagit en ställningstagande till vad du säger då, valutasidan, det är då att vi har börjat bygga position på amerikanska krediter. Och då är då investment grade delen då, men vi har köpt den produkten i euro för att ha liksom höjd på det.
Och det är inte för att det är mer komplicerat än vad det egentligen är, utan det är precis vad du är inne på. Vi vill gärna ha amerikansk företagsrisk, det vi har hellre den än europeisk. Men just med dollars race, hur mycket mer kan vi hoppas på där? Vi kanske kan köpa den exponeringen fast i en annan valuta. Det är det vi har gjort. Och utnyttjat den frihetsgraden vi har. Har du någon annan fråga om det? Klockan tickar på så vi har väl snart bränt vår tid. Vi kommer komma med ett uppföljningspoddavsnitt kring det här efter valet. Jag vet inte riktigt vilken dag det blir, men det blir ganska nära anknytning. Så antingen vet vi då vad som hände, eller så får man väl kanske upprepa mer osäkerheten för att vi fortfarande inte har räknat klart allting och Georgia ska strula en gång till i den bemärkelsen. Då får vi ta det den vägen. Men vi kommer komma med uppdatering också i veckobrev och annat då för att se vad som händer inför det här valet. Och det som jag sa till en av er här innan, det vore väl som person blir man ju rätt trött på att nu ska vi sitta och lyssna på impeachment igen här då. Men republikanerna, det gick inte igenom, men republikanerna har ju släppt en 6-punktslista på de första 6 stegen man ska göra. Och på den listan är ju att impeacha Biden. Så att vi kommer få sitta med det här igen. Troligtvis kommer marknaden inte bry sig ett dugg om det. Utan det här är bara ett spel för, ja ni vet, gallerierna helt enkelt. Men vi måste ändå sitta med det på något sätt. Och den stora risken blir kanske nästa sommars skuldtak då som vi kommer smacka in i. Hur man ska rulla det. Men det återkommer till nästa vår, helt enkelt. Så hoppas att det här gav någonting. Vi finns alltid här för frågor och kommentarer. Annars så tackar jag så hemskt mycket. Hanna, vill du säga något avslutande?
Jag hoppas som sagt att det var väldigt matnyttigt och givande att lyssna på Ian från Washington. Och som sagt, vi finns alltid tillgängliga för er här på förmögenhetsrådgivningen om ni vill prata lite mer enskilt med oss. Så det är bara att ta kontakt med mig eller med någon av mina kollegor som är här också nu vid oss. Vi tackar så hemskt mycket.
Tack så mycket för er tid.
Tack.
Tack.